When my son told the waiter I'd just share his food, I smiled silently. He didn't know I had already shared something else, his eviction date, and while he chewed his steak, I was waiting for the court envelope to arrive. He thought I was a poor, dependent, forgotten mother, but I was the only one the house was legally registered to. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Linda Hudson. I was 69 years old the day I realized my place at the table no longer came with a choice. For most of my adult life, I had been a professor of accounting at a local college in Oregon. I taught financial literacy to young adults who didn't yet understand the power of a signature, the weight of a decimal, or the quiet tyranny of control disguised as kindness. After retiring, I moved in with my son, Joshua, in the house I had helped him buy. Technically, it was mine. My name was on the deed. My money had secured the loan. But over time, that fact faded into the wallpaper like everything else about me. Joshua was turning 39 that day. He had chosen the restaurant, a new steakhouse downtown that he said had the best dry-aged ribeye in the city. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, designer shoes, and the kind of cologne that announces itself 5 seconds before the man does. His wife, Rachel, had arranged the dinner but canceled last minute, saying she had to stay home with their youngest, who had a fever. So it ended up just the two of us. We arrived around 6. The hostess greeted us warmly, led us to a window-side table, and handed us menus. I reached for mine, scanning the list out of habit more than appetite. I wasn't especially hungry, but I always enjoyed studying a menu. It reminded me of logic problems, balancing price, ingredients, portions. I noted the roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, then the butternut squash ravioli. But before I could decide, the waiter arrived. He was young, polite, and eager. He turned to Joshua first. "I'll have the 16-ounce ribeye," Joshua said with a confident nod. "Medium rare, truffle fries instead of mashed." The waiter jotted it down, then looked at me. "And for you, ma'am," Joshua chuckled before I could open my mouth. "She'll just share mine," he said. "She's not a big eater." The words landed like a fork dropped onto stone. I felt the waiter hesitate. His pen hovered midair. He glanced back at me, unsure whether to write that down or wait for a correction. I smiled, a soft, practiced thing. The kind you wear when someone steps on your foot in a crowded elevator. Not pained, not angry, just tight enough to hold back what's underneath. The waiter nodded and left. I closed the menu. I didn't argue. I didn't remind Joshua that I was capable of ordering for myself, that I had a bank account, a car, a degree, a lifetime of paying bills and raising him through broken budgets and lean years. I didn't say, "Actually, I'll have the chicken." I didn't ask for bread. I didn't even ask for water. Because the moment had already passed. It wasn't about food. It was about standing in a room you paid for and being treated like a ghost. He scrolled through his phone while we waited, talked about his job, his recent promotion, the way the younger guys at the office always asked him for advice. He didn't ask how I was sleeping, if I'd been to the doctor, if I needed anything. He didn't ask if I liked steak. He talked and I listened, nodding in rhythm, watching the flicker of candlelight on the silverware. When the meal arrived, it came with a single plate. One steak, a small pile of fries, and an extra plate placed beside me without comment. The waiter looked apologetic, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Joshua sliced into the steak and pushed a few pieces onto the smaller plate. No sauce, no garnish, just meat. "There you go," he said. "Plenty." He didn't notice that he had taken the center cuts and left me the edges. He didn't notice that I hadn't touched my fork. I looked down at the food and thought about every meal I had ever skipped so he could eat. Every sandwich I halved. Every coupon clipped. Every time I told him I wasn't hungry when I was, I looked at the plate and realized it wasn't hunger I felt. It was something denser, colder, recognition. He didn't see me as someone who had shared with him. He saw me as someone who existed to be shared. The steak tasted fine once I finally took a bite. I chewed slowly, deliberately. My mind wasn't on the food, it was on the deed. The document tucked away in a folder at the back of the cabinet in my room. My name typed neatly at the top, the signatures, the date, the quiet authority of ink and intention. He thought I was a guest. He had forgotten who gave him the table in the first place. I finished the small piece of steak and set my fork down. He was talking about a new investment property he wanted to buy, how he might take out a second mortgage if rates stayed low. I smiled again. This time it was not tight. It was calm, because I already knew what I would do. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't ask for space. I would simply serve him something of my own. And this time, he wouldn't have a choice about sharing. He ate with the kind of appetite that made me wonder if he had ever known hunger. Not the temporary kind, the skipped lunch or late dinner. I meant real hunger. The kind that gnaws at you from the inside, that makes your hands shake when the food finally comes, that forces you to pretend you're full just to give the last portion to someone you love. I had known that hunger. I had felt it during the early years, after his father left, when my salary as a lecturer was barely enough to keep the heat on. I had stretched spaghetti for 4 days. I had watered down soup. I had told him my stomach hurt just so he wouldn't ask why I wasn't eating. And now I sat across from him while he devoured his steak like the world had never denied him anything. He didn't look up when he chewed. He cut confidently, fork in his left hand, knife in his right, moving with precision, almost elegance. The juices pooled on the plate, and he dipped each piece into them before lifting it to his mouth. He chewed with small, deliberate motions, lips just parted enough to make the sound faint but constant. He paused only to speak between bites, his tone casual, almost cheerful, as if this dinner was a celebration. But I didn't feel celebrated. I sat with my plate, an afterthought, a gesture, not a meal. The fatty, uneven edges of his ribeye rested on my ceramic surface like leftovers before the fact. He hadn't asked how I liked my steak. He hadn't asked if I wanted fries. There was no salt, no pepper, no buttered roll to start with. No napkin handed across the table. There was only meat, red, tender, slightly warm, and silence, except for his voice. He talked about real estate, about market trends, about how the guy from his firm had just gotten burned buying a condo in Seattle. He laughed. I laughed too, quietly, out of habit, not amusement. My jaw moved with the effort of chewing, not the steak, but the moment itself. I had to process it slowly, without choking on the bitterness it carried. He told me he was thinking of renovating the house again. Might convert the basement into a rental unit, he said. Could bring in some extra income. I nodded, but inside, something shifted. That house, my house. He spoke of it like an asset, a chess piece, a number on a spreadsheet. But I had laid its foundation with my savings, mortgaged part of my retirement, signed documents in his name when he was too nervous to walk into a bank. I had made it possible. I had told myself it was a gift, that parents should give without keeping score. But now I realized he had been keeping score. I just hadn't known the game was still on. He reached for his water, took a sip, wiped his mouth with the corner of the cloth napkin. I noticed he had taken the only clean one the waiter had brought. Mine was still folded, untouched. I picked it up now, slowly, dabbed at my lips, and returned it to my lap. I hadn't spoken more than 2 sentences since we sat down. He didn't notice. He didn't ask. That was when I understood something deeper than disappointment. He didn't mean to be cruel. He just didn't see me anymore. I was not a guest at this table. I was part of the background, a convenience, an inherited responsibility to be managed, not honored. I thought about the afternoons I spent folding his children's laundry, about the times I waited outside their school because he and Rachel couldn't leave work early, the birthdays I paid for, the repairs I covered just this once. I thought about how I had slowly disappeared in the name of helping, how invisibility had grown like mold in the corners of every good deed. He reached the last bite of his steak, cut it carefully, lifted it with a bit of flair, like a man who enjoyed performance. And as he did, I saw a flash of a memory, vivid and sudden. A grocery store aisle, years ago, when Joshua was just 9. A stranger made a comment about me holding up the line. My hands had trembled with embarrassment, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. And then his small voice had risen, clear and unwavering. "Don't talk like that about my mom." I had looked down at him then, that fierce little boy with his chest puffed out and fists clenched, and I had cried, not from shame, but from pride so sharp it left me breathless. And now I sat across from him, watching him savor the last piece of steak he hadn't offered to share, his eyes never meeting mine. Now I cried again. But this time it was from something else entirely. He finished the steak, sat back, patted his stomach lightly, and said something about needing to hit the gym again. I smiled, a shallow thing. He asked if I wanted dessert. A brownie to split, maybe? I said I was full. And I was, full of every unspoken moment. Every time he had referred to me in the third person while I was standing beside him. Every dismissive wave. Every thankless assumption that my place in his life was fixed, permanent, and without expectation. He reached for the check. Didn't offer it to me, which I noted with strange detachment. Perhaps it was his birthday, and this was meant to be his gesture of generosity. Perhaps he thought this was repayment for all the things I had never invoiced him for. As we walked back to the car, the wind was sharp. He didn't offer me his coat. He checked his phone and told me about a work meeting he had in the morning. He didn't ask if I was warm. I sat in the passenger seat and stared out at the darkened streets, each house a reminder that people lived entire lives behind closed doors. Some were filled with love, some were filled with silence. Some, like mine, were built on sacrifice and slowly crumbling beneath the weight of being forgotten. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned to me and said, "Thanks for coming, Mom. It means a lot." I said, "Of course." My voice was quiet, controlled, but inside, I wasn't thinking about the dinner anymore. I was thinking about the drawer in my bedroom, the documents, the title, the date, the option he didn't know I had, and the moment I would use it, not in anger, but in clarity. It was nearly midnight when I opened the closet door. The house was silent, save for the soft mechanical hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the aging floorboards beneath the heating vents. The light from my bedside lamp spilled across the hardwood and lit the path to the shelf where I kept the black accordion file folder. I hadn't touched it in months, maybe longer, but I knew exactly where it was. I always knew where the important things were. I pulled the file down with both hands and carried it to the bed like something sacred. I sat with it in my lap for a moment, feeling its familiar weight. Inside it was everything that had once made me feel secure. Copies of my will, insurance policies, bank statements, tax returns. But somewhere between the lines, it had also become a reminder of everything I had signed away without realizing it. I opened the folder and flipped carefully through the labeled tabs, and there it was, deed and title, clipped neatly together with a silver paper clip. I pulled it free and laid the pages across my lap. The house we lived in was in my name, Every wall, every faucet, every floorboard creaked with my history. I had taken out the loan in my name alone. Joshua had poor credit at the time, and Rachel wasn't working. He had begged me to help, just until they got on their feet. I remembered the phone call like it had happened yesterday. His voice uncertain but urgent, promising they'd pay the mortgage once the kids were older, once his new job stabilized. I had said yes without thinking. That was the kind of mother I was, the kind who stepped in before she was asked. I had assumed it would be temporary, but time has a way of making the temporary feel permanent, especially when the gratitude fades and entitlement takes root in its place. The mortgage statements still came to me. They always had. Direct deposit from my pension account, scheduled every month like clockwork. Joshua never asked about it, never offered to take over. Somewhere along the way, I had gone from provider to invisible benefactor. And yet, he spoke of the house as his. He made decisions without me, changed the paint, hired handymen, talked about converting rooms as if I were the tenant and not the title holder. I ran my hand slowly over the top sheet. The notary stamp, the signatures, my own handwriting on the line marked owner. It was all there in black and white. Everything I needed to remind myself that I wasn't just living under a roof. I owned it. I had built it from pieces of myself no one ever saw. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes. Not dramatic ones, not emotional ones, just facts, dates of payments, property tax filings, the last appraisal. I wrote it all down, one line after another, anchoring myself in the quiet truth of ownership. In the bottom of the file, I found an unopened envelope from the mortgage company, dated 2 months earlier. I had set it aside, probably during the holiday rush, and forgotten it. I opened it now and read through the summary. The house had nearly reached full equity. It was worth more than I'd imagined. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the folder, my hands slower now, deliberate. Then I pulled a blank sheet of paper from the legal pad and wrote down a question. What do I want? Not what was fair, not what I deserved, not even what would hurt him most. Just that simple, quiet question. What do I want? I sat with it for a long time. I wanted space. I wanted dignity. I wanted to drink tea at a kitchen table without feeling like an intrusion. I wanted to live in a place where I didn't have to ask permission to exist. I wanted the freedom I had given to everyone else without ever keeping a portion for myself. I wanted my house back, not just the paperwork, the feeling, the respect, the certainty that when I unlocked the front door, I was stepping into something that belonged to me. I closed the folder and returned it to the shelf. Not because I was finished with it, but because I had just begun. The next morning, I would call an attorney, quietly, privately. I wouldn't tell Joshua. I wouldn't tell Rachel. I wouldn't tell anyone until everything was in place, because this time, I wouldn't ask for permission. I would use my name the way it was meant to be used, legally, formally, unmistakably, not as a placeholder in someone else's story, but as the author of my own. The envelope arrived 12 days after I called the attorney. It came by certified mail, thick and weighty, sealed with a red stamp at the edge of the flap. I watched the mailman walk away before I picked it up, holding it in both hands like something fragile but necessary. The name on the front was his, printed in crisp black type. The return address was the firm I had sat in quietly, across a glass desk, with my fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of my purse. I didn't hand him the envelope when he came home. I didn't place it on the kitchen counter, or slide it under his door, or leave it beside the coffee machine like a passive note. I kept it with me. I tucked it inside my drawer, beneath a stack of cookbooks I no longer used, and waited. There was power in waiting. A quiet kind of control that let me watch the rhythms of the house with sharper eyes. He moved through his routines like nothing had shifted. He made plans for summer, spoke about repainting the guest room, looked up patio furniture on his laptop, and asked Rachel about cushion colors. He made decisions as if the ground beneath him wasn't already trembling. But I didn't correct him. I nodded. I smiled. I stirred my tea. I waited 4 more days. Then, on a Monday morning, while he was upstairs getting dressed for work, I laid the envelope on the dining room table. Not hidden, not loud, just there, visible, unmistakable. I placed it perfectly parallel to the placemat he always used. The red seal faced upward. I didn't write anything on it. I didn't need to. The contents spoke more clearly than any note could. A formal notice of eviction, legally served, with the date marked in bold across the center of the page. 60 days. That's what the law required. No more, no less. I wasn't being cruel. I was being precise. The living room was still when he came down. I sat in the corner, folding laundry, listening to the sound of his shoes on the stairs. He entered the dining room with his phone in hand, muttering something about a meeting, not seeing the envelope until he reached for his keys. Then silence. A long one. I didn't look up, but I felt it. The moment he recognized the envelope. The moment his brain caught up with the reality that the name on the front was his, but the force behind it was mine. He didn't open it immediately. He stood there, one hand hovering just above the table, the other still clutching his phone. Eventually, he took the envelope and left the room. I heard the door to his office shut with a dull thud. Upstairs, a faucet turned on. Rachel was bathing the baby. The toddler was humming in the next room. It was a normal morning in every way, except one. Everything had changed. I sat still, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with calm. The kind of calm that follows a long drought of silence. The kind of calm that comes from remembering who you are when others forget. The rest of the day passed quietly. He didn't speak to me. He didn't mention the envelope. But I noticed how he walked slower, how he hovered near doorways, how he started texting more often, furiously. I imagined him calling banks, scanning documents he hadn't read in years, piecing together the truth he had so conveniently ignored. That night, he skipped dinner. Rachel said he had a headache. I nodded and continued spooning mashed potatoes onto her son's plate. She didn't ask about the envelope. I don't know if she had seen it, but her eyes lingered on me longer than usual as she poured herself water. I saw something flicker there, not confusion, not judgment, but awareness. When the children were asleep and the house was dim, I stepped outside onto the porch with a cup of tea. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint trace of charcoal from a distant barbecue. I leaned back in the wooden chair and watched the light in his office window flicker as he paced. He had known how to make me feel small, but he had forgotten that I had never been powerless. And now he knew. I sipped my tea slowly. The envelope had done its job, and it had only just begun. Saturday arrived like it always did, slow, golden, a little softer around the edges. The morning light filtered in through the blinds in narrow beams, warming the hardwood floor outside my bedroom. I got up before anyone else, padded to the kitchen in my slippers, and brewed a pot of coffee just the way I liked it. Strong, dark, no sugar. I sat at the table and watched the yard through the window, steam rising gently from my mug. The birds were louder than usual, or maybe the house was quieter. Joshua hadn't spoken to me since the envelope. He had moved through the past 5 days like someone walking across a frozen lake, careful, controlled, listening for the crack beneath every step. I watched the weight of the notice settle over him like dust. He had tried to sweep it aside, but it clung to him. I heard his footsteps above my head just after 8. Then Rachel's voice, light and forced. She always spoke more cheerfully when something was wrong, as if volume could mask tension. The children's voices came next. Short bursts of laughter, a dropped toy, a reminder to put on shoes. There was an energy in the air, but it didn't reach me. I remained invisible in plain sight, present but untouchable. By 10, the guests began to arrive. It was one of Joshua's impromptu gatherings. Nothing formal, just a grill out with friends from his office and a few neighbors. They brought six-packs, chips, bottles of wine. I heard the familiar cadence of small talk from the patio. Lawn chairs scraped across the deck. Laughter spilled through the open screen door, and music started playing from a Bluetooth speaker somewhere near the hedges. It was a song I remembered from years ago, back when Joshua was still in high school. He used to dance in the kitchen when he thought no one was watching. I stayed inside, not because I wasn't invited, but because I wasn't expected. There's a difference. I sliced vegetables in the kitchen, quietly, methodically. I wasn't asked to help, but I couldn't stand to see things done halfway. The knives were dull, the cutting board warped at the edges. I made do. I always did. At some point, Joshua stepped inside to grab something from the fridge. He glanced at me, said nothing, then left with a jar of pickles and a bottle of mustard. He didn't meet my eyes. He hadn't, not since the envelope. I carried the tray of sliced vegetables to the edge of the kitchen counter and left it there. Someone eventually noticed it and brought it outside. I heard them compliment the spread. Joshua mumbled something about my mom always being good at that stuff. That stuff. Not the bills, not the mortgage, not the roof over his head, just the snacks. The hours passed in heat and shadows. The sun moved across the yard, leaving gold on the grass and sweat on their foreheads. They laughed. They told stories. Joshua grilled burgers and passed out paper plates. His voice was steady, but I recognized the strain. He was hosting like a man who needed to prove nothing had changed. But it had. I watched from the window as he poured drinks and slapped backs and nodded at things he wasn't really hearing. The man who had once joked that I'd just share his food was now feeding 12 people on a deck that no longer belonged to him. That thought didn't make me bitter. It made me still. There's a kind of peace that comes from no longer needing to be heard, from letting the truth speak through silence. Later in the afternoon, one of the guests, a young woman in sunglasses and white sandals, wandered into the kitchen looking for more napkins. She smiled when she saw me and asked if I was Josh's mom. I nodded. "You must love living here," she said. "Such a beautiful house." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "It's mine," I said. She blinked, smiled again, more politely this time, then thanked me and left. I returned to the sink and started washing the dishes no one had noticed piling up. The water was hot, the soap harsh on my hands. I scrubbed quietly, listening to the party through the open window. Joshua's voice rose and fell, louder when he laughed, quieter when the laughter didn't follow. By early evening, the guests began to leave. Cars pulled out of the driveway one by one. The music dimmed, chairs were folded, plates were discarded. The yard returned to its original silence. He came back inside last. His shirt was stained with ketchup and smoke. He smelled like sweat and charcoal. He paused in the doorway, looked around the kitchen, and didn't say anything. He walked past me and poured himself a glass of water. Then he leaned against the counter, shoulders hunched, head tilted slightly forward. For a moment, I thought he might speak, but he didn't. He drank his water, set the glass in the sink beside the ones I had already cleaned, and went upstairs. That night, as I sat on the porch alone, the air thick with the scent of cooked meat and cut grass, I felt something shift in me. Not anger, not even sadness, certainty, because all day he had hosted a party in a home he would soon leave, and not a single one of them knew. Not yet, But I did, and sometimes being the only one who knows is more powerful than all the noise in the world. The morning it happened was quiet, not unusually so, but in that thick, expectant way, like the air before a thunderstorm, or the hush that falls right before a secret leaves someone's mouth. I had woken early, though I hadn't slept much the night before. Sleep had become a shallow thing lately. I drifted in and out of it, never fully giving myself over to the softness of rest. There was something in me that was always listening, waiting, counting the days. By then, the envelope had sat unopened on his desk for over a week. I knew he had seen it. I had watched him walk past it every day. He would glance at it, once in the morning and again in the evening, like a man pacing outside a locked door. But he hadn't touched it. I suppose there was comfort in pretending that unopened mail had no consequences, that if he didn't break the seal, he could also suspend the reality it carried. But something shifted that morning. I heard him come downstairs just after 8. His footsteps were slower than usual, his pace uncertain. He poured himself a cup of coffee, too loudly, and stood for a long while by the window, the same one I used to lean against while watching him play in the yard when he was small. The cup clinked against the counter. He took one sip, then another, then set it down. I was in the living room, pretending to read. The same page of the same book for the past 3 mornings. He didn't look in my direction as he walked past. Then the sound of a chair scraping, the creak of a drawer, the tear of a seal. A moment later, silence, the kind that doesn't last long but stretches wide enough to swallow a room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe differently. I didn't lean to listen. I simply waited. The minutes ticked by like they were being measured. Then I heard it, barely, but there, a breath, sharp and caught in his throat. The unmistakable sound of someone rereading the same sentence over and over again, hoping the meaning would change if he looked at it long enough. But the words on that paper weren't interested in interpretation. I had sat with the attorney for almost an hour when we drafted it. Every line was clear, legal, polite, neutral in tone, but absolute in message. The property was mine. The notice was lawful. 60 days, no extensions, no renegotiation. Just the truth, delivered in ink and letterhead. When he finally appeared in the doorway of the living room, I didn't look up at first. I wanted him to say something, but he didn't. I could feel him standing there, holding the paper in one hand, arms stiff, shoulders angled like a question mark. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. He was confused, disoriented, like a man looking at a map he didn't recognize. I looked up slowly, and I saw it. His face, not the one he wore at work, not the one he showed his children, not the one that made jokes at the grill while holding a beer like a badge of adulthood. This one was bare, stripped of entitlement, stripped of control. He looked at me like I had become a stranger, but I wasn't the stranger. He was. He had drifted so far from the boy I raised, the one who once held my hand during thunderstorms and asked if monsters were real. He had become a man who forgot who built the roof over his head, who mistook silence for permission and dependence for generosity. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again. I watched his fingers tighten around the paper. His knuckles paled. He asked if we could talk. I nodded, but I didn't move. He sat down on the edge of the armchair, his knees too wide, his spine too straight, like he couldn't figure out how to sit comfortably in his own house. He said my name, not Mom, just Linda. That told me everything. He said he hadn't expected this. I told him that was obvious. He said it felt like a betrayal. I said nothing, because I knew what betrayal really looked like. It looked like a mother sitting in a restaurant, being told she'd be sharing dinner with the man she once carried through flu seasons and divorce papers and college tuition. It looked like a son who talked about equity but forgot about effort. He asked if this was really necessary. I didn't respond. He already had his answer in his hands. He looked down at the notice again. His lips moved slightly, like he was rereading it, even though by now he had memorized every word. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the yard. He said quietly that he didn't know what to say. I didn't offer him anything, because sometimes silence isn't a punishment. It's a mirror, and I wanted him to sit in it. He turned and walked out of the room. The paper hung limply from his fingers now, no longer stiff. Just a document, just a reality. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. But when I looked at his face one last time before he disappeared down the hallway, I saw what I had been waiting for. Not anger, not denial, but recognition. He finally understood what power looks like when it's no longer afraid to show itself. And it was wearing my face. Later that afternoon, I was sitting on the back porch with a glass of iced tea when my youngest grandson came outside. He had his sneakers on the wrong feet and a plastic dinosaur clutched in one hand. He climbed onto the bench beside me and leaned his small head against my arm. He asked why his dad looked so sad. I turned to him slowly. His eyes were honest, wide, and waiting. "He said you're making him leave," he said. "Are you, Grandma?" I set my glass down and wrapped my arm gently around his shoulders. "No," I said softly. "I'm not making him leave." He looked up at me, uncertain. "I'm just letting go," I added, "of what no longer holds me." He didn't ask another question. He just nodded the way children do when they accept something they don't yet understand, but somehow still feel is true. And we sat there together, quietly, in the peace that followed letting go. He came to me late that night. The hallway was dim, lit only by the soft glow from the kitchen nightlight. I had just turned off my reading lamp, preparing to rest, but I wasn't asleep. I wasn't even tired. My body had been still for hours, but my thoughts had been pacing, tracing every possibility that might come next. His knock was barely audible, a hesitant tap against my door frame, not the door itself, as if he didn't want to make a full commitment to entering, or to whatever might be said. I told him to come in. My voice was even, not cold, just measured. He stepped inside slowly, his bare feet soundless on the carpet. He looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from something deeper, like the architecture of certainty had begun to collapse inside him, and now he wasn't sure how to rebuild it. He sat on the chair near the window, the one where I sometimes watch the birds in the morning. He didn't touch anything on the nightstand. He kept his hands folded in his lap. I noticed how his fingers twitched slightly, like he was trying to summon the right words from the air. He said he wanted to talk. I waited. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me, that it hadn't been his intention to make me feel small or invisible, that he'd been stressed, distracted, trying to juggle work, family, finances, that sometimes things slipped through the cracks. I didn't interrupt him. He talked about the house, about how he always thought of it as ours, about how he never imagined it could be taken from him. He used the word taken more than once, as if this had all come out of nowhere, as if he hadn't been given every opportunity to recognize what he had. He said he knew things had gotten out of balance, that maybe he hadn't shown enough appreciation, that maybe he'd been a little thoughtless. But he also said that families were supposed to work through things, that this felt final in a way that frightened him. Still, I said nothing, because I knew he wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for permission to stay who he was. He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees. He spoke about the kids, about how uprooting them would be hard, about how Rachel was overwhelmed, about how moving would complicate everything. His voice stayed soft, but there was a current under it, an undercurrent of pleading that wanted to be disguised as reason. He said he was sorry, but he didn't say what for. Not for dismissing me at the restaurant, not for reducing me to an afterthought in the house I paid for, not for all the times he referred to me as a burden in rooms where I could hear him. He said sorry the way people do when they want to escape consequence, not accept it. When he finally went quiet, the room settled into a new kind of silence. Not heavy, but not gentle either. A silence that waited. I looked at him for a long time, and then I spoke. Not a monologue, not a lecture, not a list of grievances, just a few sentences. I told him that intentions mean nothing without awareness, that love without respect is just obligation in disguise, that silence, when repeated long enough, becomes its own kind of violence, and that some shifts, once made, are irreversible. I told him I wasn't angry. I was awake. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just sat back in the chair, the air knocked slightly out of his lungs, like he'd been holding a defense that never got used. We didn't fight. There was no shouting, no blame tossed back and forth, just the slow realization that the shape of our relationship had changed, and it wasn't going back to what it was. Eventually, he stood, nodded once, a quiet nod, not of agreement, but of acceptance. He said he would figure things out, and I believed him, because for the first time, he understood that I wasn't asking for anything. I wasn't negotiating. This wasn't a conversation about compromise. It was a moment of clarity, and I had nothing left to explain. The next morning, it was Rachel who came to me. She knocked not like a daughter-in-law, but like someone arriving with purpose. I opened the door to find her standing stiffly, her eyes tired but alert, her hands clutching a folder that had nothing inside it. A prop, something to hold so she wouldn't fidget. She said she just wanted to talk. Said she didn't want things to get out of hand. Said, "Linda, this is all a misunderstanding." She called it a miscommunication, a lapse, a moment of stress blown out of proportion. "We're family," she said. "We can fix this. You don't really want the kids caught in the middle of this mess, do you?" Her voice was soft, but I could feel the pressure behind it. A careful layering of guilt and fear, of politeness wrapped tightly around control. She smiled the way people smile when they're not sure if they're asking or warning. I looked at her for a moment and then stepped back to let her speak. She talked for several minutes about unity, about forgiveness, about what it might look like if we rolled things back. She didn't say the word eviction. She didn't say the word consequence, but both hung heavy in the room, unspoken and undeniable. When she finally stopped, her expression softened, as if waiting for my better nature to step forward and make peace. But I had no peace left to trade. I folded my hands gently in my lap. "I'm not traumatizing anyone," I said. "I'm just done being convenient." She blinked. I said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. She left without further protest, and I sat still for a long time afterward, feeling the strange hush of a door that's been quietly closed and finally locked, from my side. The morning after our conversation, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically. No boxes by the door, no moving trucks, no echoes of emptiness in the hallway, but because something invisible had shifted, something foundational. The way you feel when a picture is finally hung straight on the wall after years of being slightly tilted. I moved through the rooms with quieter feet, not out of caution, but out of ownership. I made coffee and drank it at the kitchen table, where I used to sit before I began shrinking into corners. The mug felt heavier in my hand, and the light coming through the window didn't seem quite so cold. The silence wasn't laced with tension anymore. It was mine. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to speak first, or for someone to interrupt, or for someone to hand me a task disguised as conversation. He stayed upstairs longer than usual. When he finally came down, he didn't say much. He poured his coffee and left without making eye contact. I didn't follow him. I didn't ask where he was going. His presence didn't determine the rhythm of my morning anymore. I had reclaimed that, quietly, entirely. Later that week, I began reorganizing the house. I started in the living room, moving furniture inch by inch, creating space where there had once been clutter. I took down the art his wife had hung, the abstract prints in soulless frames, the generic live, laugh, love signs that never felt like mine. I packed them carefully and stacked them in the hall closet. Then I pulled out the old painting that had hung in my first apartment, a blue heron in flight, painted in sweeping strokes by an artist I met at a market in Maine. I hung it above the fireplace. It belonged there. It always had. I cleared the bookshelf next. I removed the business manuals, the self-help guides, the magazines about property and capital gains. I replaced them with poetry, with novels I had read and reread until the spines gave in, with my mother's copy of Wuthering Heights, brittle with age and dog-eared from love. I placed a candle beside them, lit it, let the flame flicker gently over words that made me feel known. In the kitchen, I opened every drawer. I threw out the chipped mugs and mismatched containers, the novelty gadgets that served no purpose but to take up space. I polished the silverware I'd inherited from my grandmother and placed it back in the drawer like it was meant to be there, not hidden behind plastic and rust. I cleaned the pantry, alphabetized the spices, bought fresh herbs and placed them on the windowsill. Rosemary, thyme, basil. I planted roots in small clay pots and watered them each morning with the kind of attention I used to give to everyone else. The backyard was next. I trimmed the overgrown hedges that had blocked the view of the fence for years. I pulled weeds until my back ached, then sat on the porch and looked at what I'd uncovered: soil, sun, and space. I ordered a small bench online. When it arrived, I placed it beneath the elm tree. I sat there each evening and listened to the world move without me needing to chase it. His wife stopped speaking to me entirely. She moved around the house like a stranger, as if unsure how to occupy space in a home that no longer answered to her. I didn't challenge it. We were two women passing through separate storms. She'd made her choices. So had I. The children remained innocent. They still ran into the room with drawings, still asked me for snacks, still curled beside me on the couch during cartoons. They didn't know why their parents whispered behind closed doors, or why boxes began appearing slowly in the hallway. I never let them see my victory. I only showed them my presence. And slowly, the house began to breathe again. I found the rhythm of music in the kitchen. I played jazz on Saturday mornings and classical on Sunday evenings. I cooked with both hands, without needing to finish by someone else's timeline. I read late into the night without apologizing for the light under the door. I hummed while folding laundry. I left books open on the armrest. I wore soft slippers and thick cardigans, not to disappear but to feel wrapped in comfort. My bedroom became a sanctuary again. I bought new curtains, pale blue like the morning sky. I framed old photographs of my childhood, of my parents, of Joshua as a baby, back when he still reached for my hand instinctively. I placed them where I could see them before sleep. Each room told a different version of me, not the mother they used when it was convenient, not the placeholder, but the woman who had paid the bills, cooked the meals, sacrificed her name for their comfort, and had now finally remembered her worth. The house was mine again, not because he left, but because I stayed. It was a Thursday afternoon when she knocked on my door. I had been in the garden most of the morning, digging up the dead roots of what used to be marigolds and replacing them with tulip bulbs I had picked up from the nursery down the road. My knees ached. My gloves were stained, and my back was reminding me that time was no longer something I could ignore. But my spirit felt light, the kind of light that comes not from sunshine or compliments, but from the slow, private restoration of something that had nearly been lost. I was in the kitchen washing my hands when I heard the knock. It wasn't hesitant or loud, just simple, polite, the kind of knock that says, "I'm here, but I won't stay unless you let me." I dried my hands and opened the door. It was Nancy from 3 houses down. I had seen her walking her dog nearly every evening for the last 2 years. We'd exchanged waves, a few brief conversations about the weather, the neighborhood association's questionable landscaping choices, and once, on a particularly cold morning, the best brand of thermal socks. She had kind eyes and silver hair always pulled back in a neat twist. That day, she carried a small loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper and tied with twine. She said she'd been meaning to come by, that she'd heard, gently and indirectly, that things in the house had changed. I invited her in without asking why. The door opened without resistance. The hallway felt wider with her steps in it. We sat at the kitchen table, the one I had cleared just a week before of the clutter that never belonged to me. I made tea, served it in the china I used to save for guests who never appreciated it. Nancy complimented the color of the curtains and the smell of the bread I had baked earlier that morning. I told her about the rosemary in the window. She told me about her cat who only drank from the bathtub faucet. We laughed quietly, like people who had both waited too long for something that should have come easily. The conversation flowed without effort. No one talked over the other. No one hurried to fill the silences. We spoke about aging, not as something to mourn, but as a shedding, a simplification, a return. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear another woman say things I had thought only to myself. She understood the unspoken, the bruises of invisibility, the slow erosion of self in favor of everyone else's comfort. She stayed for almost 2 hours. Before she left, she asked if I might like to walk with her sometime. She said her knees weren't what they used to be, and it was nice having someone who understood the rhythm of slow steps. I told her I'd like that. She smiled, not too wide, but with her whole face. When the door closed behind her, the house didn't feel empty. It felt fuller somehow, as if someone had lit a lantern in one of the darker corners and left it glowing for me to find later. That weekend, we walked together, slowly in comfortable shoes, with hats that shielded our eyes and kept the sun off our necks. We talked about books, about soup, about old movies. We didn't talk about our children until the third walk. When we did, it wasn't to complain. It was to confess. She had her own version of a Joshua, and I had my own version of silence. We nodded in the same places. We didn't try to fix each other's stories. We just held them. After that, she came by often, sometimes with a pie, sometimes with nothing but time. We sat in the yard when the weather allowed, sharing blankets and watching the wind move through the trees. I taught her how to trim the hydrangeas. She showed me how to knit without dropping stitches. And then one day, another neighbor joined, then another. Women who had seen me as the quiet one before, now sitting on my porch with lemonade and stories, and the kind of laughter that doesn't need permission. The house began to hum again, not with obligation, not with chores or commands or tight schedules, but with presence. I started leaving the porch light on longer at night, not because I was waiting for anyone, but because it felt good to signal that someone was home, and that home was open, warm, safe. I no longer checked my phone to see if Joshua would call. I no longer looked at the calendar counting down the days. I no longer measured my worth by who invited me to dinner or who didn't. I baked. I wrote postcards I didn't need to send. I organized my recipe box. I took deep breaths without apology. I wore earrings again. I walked barefoot through the grass and let my toes stain green. I had once been told I would just share someone else's plate, but now I served from my own table, and there was always enough. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch with slices of peach pie cooling in our hands, Nancy pulled a folded copy of the local paper from her bag. She said she thought I might want to see something. On the third page, just above the fold, there was a small column, no byline, no pictures, just a short piece about elderly homeowners, about their right to maintain control over their properties and decisions, even within families. It described, in broad strokes, a woman who had quietly, lawfully, reclaimed her home after being pushed into silence. No names, no dates, just a story. But I recognized it, every sentence. Nancy smiled when I lowered the paper. My smile, though smaller, lingered. It wasn't pride. It wasn't revenge. It was the quiet satisfaction of being heard, even anonymously, and knowing someone else might read it and feel just a little less alone. I went back to the restaurant, not out of bitterness, not out of ritual, just because I wanted to. It had been nearly 2 months since the last time I sat there, across from my son, with the weight of silence on my plate and the taste of someone else's decision in my mouth. That meal had settled in my memory like a stone at the bottom of a well, cold, unmoving, but no longer dragging me under. It was just there, part of the past, part of the shape of everything that followed. This time, I made a reservation under my own name. I arrived 10 minutes early. The hostess greeted me with a polite smile and led me to a small table near the window. It was early afternoon, not quite lunch rush, so the dining room was still half lit with quiet. The same soft jazz played overhead, the same worn menus, the same silverware wrapped tightly in cloth napkins, but everything felt different. Everything felt mine. I sat down with ease. No one rushed me, no one interrupted. The waiter arrived, young, new, or perhaps just someone I hadn't noticed before, and asked if I'd like to start with a drink. I ordered an iced tea with lemon, real lemon, not a plastic wedge. Then I opened the menu and read every item, slowly, thoughtfully, not to be efficient, not to avoid being a burden, just because I could. I chose the roasted chicken with garlic and thyme, with mashed potatoes and green beans, not because it was simple or safe, but because it reminded me of Sunday dinners in the house I grew up in, where meals were never portioned by power and everyone had a seat that mattered. I added a side salad. I asked for extra dressing. I didn't flinch. When the food arrived, it was beautiful, steam rising, plates balanced just so, everything placed with care. No one said I'd be sharing. No one assumed I didn't need my own. The waiter asked if everything looked good, and I smiled and said it looked perfect. Because it did. I took my time eating. I didn't scroll through a phone or pretend to be busy. I just sat, chewed slowly, watched the way sunlight moved across the floor, watched strangers enjoy meals without knowing they were part of the quietest kind of victory. With every bite, I remembered things I had forgotten. How I used to love green beans with cracked pepper, how mashed potatoes tasted best when still steaming, how warm bread felt in the hand when you pulled it apart yourself, not as an offering, but as a choice. I didn't think about Joshua. Not really. He existed now like a closed book on a shelf, still mine, still part of the story, but not in my hands. What I thought about was the sound of my own fork against porcelain, the rhythm of eating without waiting for someone else to finish first, the strange, quiet joy of ordering something you want and being the only person it belongs to. When I finished, I ordered dessert, chocolate cake, rich, dense, with a dollop of whipped cream that melted just slightly around the edges. The waiter raised an eyebrow and asked if I'd like it to go. I shook my head and said no. It was for here, for me. I ate it slowly. I didn't share a bite. I didn't feel guilty, I didn't measure it against anything but the moment. As I paid the check, I left a generous tip, not to be remembered, but to mark the moment, to say, I was here. I sat at this table. I ordered. I enjoyed. And when I walked out into the sunlight, the warmth didn't surprise me. It felt right. It felt earned. It felt like freedom. A table just for me, a meal just for me, and a life finally lived without apology.